O death, where is thy sting? 1 Corinthians 15:55-57, King James's version of Scripture. Or as the Bard put it, to be or not to be. Perhaps more mundanely, Socrates' last words were, Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay it and do not neglect it. The Hippocratic Oath, this version dating from 275 AD, but the oath itself having originated in perhaps the 5th or 4th century BC, reads as follows. I swear by Apollo Healer, by Asclepius, by Hygeia, by Panacea, and by all the gods and goddesses, making them my witnesses, that I will carry out, according to my ability and judgment, this oath and this indenture. Into whatever house I enter, I will enter to help the sick, and I will abstain from all intentional wrongdoing and harm, especially from abusing the bodies of man or woman, bond or free. In other words, be they bondsmen, serfs, villains, slaves, depending on the context, or freemen, the physician swears by the gods of healing, of which Asclepius is one, that he shall do no harm. Very different are the purpose and intention of the necromancer. Necromancy was in fact very much what was referred to when one spoke of magic during the Middle Ages. In the real world, it largely means communicating with the dead, rather than raising skeletons and zombies. Necros means dead body, and manteia, divination. So perhaps in Dungeons and Dragons terms, medieval necromancy is more akin to the magical school of divination in that fantasy game. Though I feel that communication with the dead, communication to obtain secrets rather than control or use the dead for combat, etc., is not near enough the focus it should be in D&D and other fantasy. Necromancy, the same family as oneromancy, which is the interpretation of dreams for divination. In the Middle Ages, necromancy was viewed by the Catholic Church as a maleficium. If you just taste that wonderful word, maleficium, it's a sort of juicy, musty word, maleficium. In the Middle Ages, it was then viewed as an art for conjuring demons, which in D&D terms, again, would be more associated with the discipline or school of conjuration. In the histories and religions of many fantasy worlds, concepts of death, immortality, undeath, birth, rebirth, and resurrection are central themes. Difference between rebirth and resurrection? Well, the way I interpret it is rebirth is always from infancy, whereas resurrection is being alive again from any age, returning to being exactly the same body and shape as before. A central theme of Tolkien's works, Tolkien being the sort of modern father of fantasy, is the immortality of elves as contrasted with the mortality of men. And I prefer that term men rather than humans. It sounds more archaic and fantasy-like, whereas human sounds more scientific. Sad that elvish immortality should have been lost with the transition to D&D. This is because probably of the lawsuit which occurred in the 1970s, whereby the Tolkien estate sued TSR, Gygax, and the D&D people for having borrowed, if you like, or exploited without paying anything, if you prefer, the concepts and most of the things really in Tolkien's works. So what's remained of the elves of Tolkien in D&D? Well, it's the pointy ears and its slightly longer lifespans. Now, the pointy ears are just mentioned in Tolkien once in a letter, so it's not even, official canon in any way. What's more prevalent in his description of elves are the starlit eyes, that and halos, or their faces and heads beaming with light, especially those of the Calaquendi, the elves of light, who had seen the two trees, the lights of Valinor, that of silver and that of gold. And for all elves, it's the starlight lingering in their eyes, the starlight that was kindled in their eyes as they opened them when Vada, the goddess of the stars, rekindled the stars and thereby awoke the elves in Cuivienen in the east of Middle-earth. So it's a shame that this immortality of the elves, and also their special properties, superior sight, as well as being able to see much better than men, the ability to see as far a starlit night as a man in full daylight, better hearing, better sense of smell, etc., in addition to their immortality, should have been watered down as just to make them pointy-eared, sort of fantasy Vulcans with slightly longer lives, by the way, diminished for each edition of the game, that they are in Dungeons and Dragons. I think Tolkien's brilliance mainly lay in this. He made it so that elves are immortal in the sense that they cannot die from old age, but they can be slain from weapons, fall off a cliff, and die in another way that abuses the body. Even though they are hardy and do not die easily from physical abuse, especially the West Elves, who are basked in the light of the two trees of Valinor, and probably have more hit points than the East Elves or the Moriquendi, the Dark Elves, which are not the same as Drow or Dark Elves in D&D, not the silver-haired and black-skinned creatures of D&D, but just elves, but those not having seen the light of Valinor, i.e. therefore being dark. So the elves are not immortal in the traditional sense that perhaps Superman, aside from being able to be harmed by kryptonite, or gods in most real-world religions, or Asterix in the Adventures of Asterix, at least when he's affected by the magic elixir brewed by the druid, that they cannot be harmed by anything, that they are totally and completely immortal, but that rather that they are immortal in regards to not aging and not being affected by illness. And this is stated in both Tolkien and in the works of Iron Crown Enterprises. And here MERP stands out, Middle-earth role-playing, which was the sort of go-to product for fantasy role-playing when one was a Tolkien fan in the 80s and 90s, as I was. So they are unable to be affected by aging or by disease. And this has largely been lost in contemporary role-playing and contemporary fantasy. I think in role-playing largely because their superior stats and their superior senses are sort of contrary to the notion that you must make role-playing games balanced, whatever that means. Whereas I think the real reason why you play a role-playing game, or why you read fantasy books or watch a fantasy film or theatre play, is that you want to, immerse yourself in those characters, in the lives of the fantasy races. Whether they're superior or inferior to mortal men doesn't really matter, because it's the otherworldliness and the stupendous difference of these character races that attracts you. At least it does me. So I think it doesn't really matter that some character races are superior to others, that elves are more intelligent, charismatic, strong, and so forth than men, and that some species of orc are decidedly less so, that they're much inferior to most other races, weaker, dim-witted, etc. That's perfectly fine, because you want to immerse yourself in that character, in that role. Doesn't matter if they're stronger or weaker. Well, anyway, the ideas of mortality and immortality that are present in Tolkien's works, I think you can capitalize on those and implement in your own games, in your own fantasy literature, if you're a writer and so forth. And that's really the main purpose of this podcast, is to awaken you to that very special immortality of Tolkien's elves, and to the mortality of men, and the fact that necromancy is really the only way that man can achieve immortality. Find that gods, elves, unicorns, Pegasi, Kirin, perhaps other fantasy fairy races than elves, such as nymphs, sprites, nixies, satyrs, and so forth, can also be immortal in the elven sense. And perhaps not even the gods should be unkillable, at least by magical weapons. We all know that elves can be killed by non-magical weapons, but perhaps the gods could be killable, though with a really, really high amount of HP, by magical weapons. And if you want to make gods immortal, perhaps you can at least unhouse them, like Sauron was unhoused at the end of the Third Age, that his soul was permanently expelled from any body. that he couldn't form a physical form ever again, or expelled from the world, the way Morgoth, Melkor, the evil Valar, the evil god, is cast into the void by the other Valar, or that Rovagug, the god, the giant in the world of Golarion, in the Pathfinder role-playing preeminent scenario, is housed or imprisoned in the world of Golarion, so that when he snores, he's asleep. When he snores, he causes earthquakes and so forth. So maybe that's an alternative to having gods killable by magical means. That man is largely mortal, and I don't think man should, or any other the killable races of fantasy, let's just call them that, should be able to turn into gods. Not men, not elves, not dwarves, or any other of the races. Which means that the only way that man can become immortal is through necromancy. And this theme is used very repeatedly by Tolkien himself. For instance, the High Men of the West, the Dunedain of Númenor, which is the island between Middle-earth, where most men live, and Valinor, Aman, the land of gift, with the Valar and the Maiar, the lesser deities of Tolkien's legendarium, and the elves, where they live. That the men of Westerners, they envied elvish immortality, and they wanted to gain it. And they did so in various ways. For instance, they mounted a great expedition, created a large fleet, an enormous host of sailing vessels that sailed onto the west, because they thought if they stepped onto the undying lands of Valinor, they too would become deathless, like the Valar, Maiar, and elves. But it wasn't naturally the undying lands themselves that made anybody undying. They were called thus because of the deathless nature of the folk who dwelt there. And when the tragedy being, when the Númenóreans invaded Valinor, when they stepped on Valinor, on that land, the Valar made the mountains rise up and envelop them, fall over them, so that they were permanently enclosed in a cave, and were essentially deathless, but couldn't enjoy their immortality because they were in a permanent state of internment. Right. Aside from this huge expedition, which culminates the Númenórean experience, the men of Westerners also, as particularly their kings, built necropolis and housed their dead as embalmed creatures, to try to prolong at least the body and its existence on the material plane. So that's really the Númenórean experience, and it also proves that necromancy is a very potent tool when it comes to man achieving immortality, though it's a sort of corrupt and a sort of sordid, cursed immortality, as opposed to the blessed and harmonious, vibrant lives of elves, the blessed people, because elves are immortal and vibrantly alive in the fantasy world. They live forever. They cannot become undead of any kind, and they consequently don't fear the spirits of dead men, the way Legolas does not fear the spirits of the dead men of Dun Harrow. Nor should they, in my opinion, parenthetically, be susceptible to lycanthropy, because they cannot contract any illnesses.